Great to have you with us on the show today, Sanusha. Now, let's start off with the fact that analysts are saying that South Africa could lose billions of dollars in export revenues, especially if we see some retaliation from its trading partners. What's your take on the stakes for South Africa with its continued maybe silence or silence on the issue?
Good evening to you and to the viewers. I think it's been this very critical dilemma and predicament that South Africa has found itself in, particularly the government, where it's now being pushed into this into essentially making much more clearer, coherent, and trying to get South Africa to say to the rest of its international partners, in particular the economic actors you mentioned, that this is how we see the war in Ukraine, this is how we want to actually approach it, and to try and utilize that economic instrumentation of the relationship to say, well, we want you to make a much more clearer announcement and pronouncement on this in terms of your relationship with Russia. Now, that's all good and well, because that's in a sense how this international system works. It's never been a fair system. It's never been predicated on inclusivity. It's always been about how particular instruments of geopolitics and geoeconomic interests have been utilized to play within the geostrategic ambit of countries and used as diplomacy. What we are seeing now is, I think, the upping of the ante of that. It's no longer the post-Cold War period of where people or where countries were allowed to actually negotiate their spaces as well. It's much more aggressive. It's much more based on a military-industrial complex. And I think the challenge here is that we're talking about an economy, we're talking about a country that has been vulnerable even before the crisis in Ukraine took place, or the invasion or the conflict emerged last year in February, that our economy was not necessarily in a place where we could actually afford to talk about losing more and more because of the energy crisis, because of unemployment, because of economic issues that were not necessarily structural economic reforms that were not taking place at fast pace, and business was, and of course we're coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think on the one hand, my reaction to your question is, I understand the economics of this, I understand the impact of this is, but on the other hand, I think it also raises a number of critical points for African countries who are going to go to St. Petersburg in July for the Russia-Africa summit, and what is going to happen then? Are those countries where, for example, also have the same trading partners who contribute a lot or are big trading partners for those economies in Africa, are they going to actually also have a similar kind of reaction to their economy? So I think right now what we are witnessing is how the trade and economic issues are being utilized in a politicized way to try and push an agenda which sometimes I think will backfire.
And you're right, Sanusha. And of course, we have to know that South Africa is a sovereign nation. But I'd love to get a sense of whether you think it is clear what the government's reasoning is, because it has maintained this nonaligned stance toward the conflict. It's also abstained despite UN votes from condemning Russia. What really is the reasoning behind it?
I think there's two ways in which you can interpret this. One, I think, is really the point you raised about sovereignty. And I think that becomes part and parcel of a reaction. And I think that's what really underpins what is happening in terms of how South Africa, or rather the government, in terms of its diplomacy and the way it's interpreting the issues around non-alignment, is that it's saying that we can't be goaded into something that we feel is an issue that has to be resolved in terms of a peaceful negotiation. I think what is really critical here is that South Africa has, in a way, also talked about issues, particularly the ANC-led government has spoken, and the party itself has spoken about issues that tend to come across or imply that it's more kind of empathetic towards Russia than it is to Ukraine. And I think that then sets the cat amongst the pigeons, so to speak, because what it does then, it kind of says, well, are you non-aligned? Let me give you an example. if you look at countries in the BRICS, if you look at with the exception of Russia and China, but if you look at India, for example, India actually has a very interesting way in which it actually navigates this. It uses its foreign policy ambit of strategic autonomy, and it is an important actor for the gatekeepers of the international system in the quadrilateral security grouping, the Quad. It's also a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was created by China, and of course it buys Russian oil. Now, this is interesting because India is seen as an important bridge role. It's seen as an important actor. So at the same time, as much as South Africa is being told you're going to lose all of the economic benefits, you're actually going to end up possibly not getting onto the AGOA review list, because that is what's also critical here. I think there's a sense of mischievousness and deviousness when it comes to the way these issues are being played out in the international system. And I think at that level, where South Africa doesn't come out very clear is not to also keep saying, well, historically, this is how we've seen Russia. And I think you got to also remember that the Russia you're talking about today is not the Soviet Union of yesteryear. And that kind of relationship, I think, historically also raises a number of contradictions for the South African government. And so those are the two kind of interpretations that are essentially juxtaposing each other and creating this dilemma and predicament.
Quite right. And when you look at the fact that, as we mentioned earlier, the EU and the US account for about 30% of South Africa's exports, it is a critical situation. As you mentioned, the ANC sometimes seems a little neutral or raises questions about how sound South Africa's neutrality is, given its increasing economic, military, and also diplomatic engagement with Russia. Are there any valid points when they say that South Africa could be neutral, even given the BRICS group as well? It could be neutral because of those factors.
Well, I think we've entered an unprecedented moment in the international arena. I think that this point that we talk about in terms of a deepening multilateralism, I'm not sure how your neutrality can actually remain neutral. You can remain neutral where you are now in this inflection point in the international system. So I think on the one hand, even the way we qualify the question of neutrality and non-alignment. I think non-alignment is also now not wanting to be caught in the kind of dynamics around whether you have to make some serious choices and serious diplomatic concessions in terms of where you find yourself on the right, and I say this in inverted commas, on the right side of history. And I think right now, if you think about the international system, I think what the ANC-led government is doing is in a rhetorical way, and sometimes it can become a bit complex in the way that they portray it, is that they're reacting to a system that has never been inclusive. They are reacting to a system where regional blocks are becoming much more important, and that challenges the status quo of the global system itself. It challenges the status quo of those that have constantly retained that they are the gatekeepers of the system. And so at the end of the day, what happens then is that your reaction is what becomes the provocation. And so then your neutrality is questioned. I think what we need to start thinking about now is if we are to speak about a deepening multilateral system, or if we're talking about a system that is really in a state of fluidity and it's inflamed and you're ending up in a situation where countries are now have to basically think about how they position themselves, not just on the Ukraine-Russia crisis, I think future crises as well. I think at the end of the day, it's about whether or not we can reform the system, because that has been the rhetoric of the BRICS, and that has been the rhetoric of the reform of the global financial architecture, as well as of the G20. I just want to put in a little side note into this conversation. Next year, Brazil is going to host the G20. And I think that they are going to also be looking at how this issue around Russia, South Africa, neutrality and non-alignment is going to play out, because at the end of the day, the question would be, what will be the reaction of Putin going to Brazil for the G20 summit and the whole question of the international system, ICC and international law?
Well, currently, I'd love to get a sense of your take on whether we're being a little bit too, sentiment is being a little bit too worried around the fact that South Africa's perceived closeness to Russia could pose increased risk, not just to export revenues, but also to its markets. They say it's likely to drive away foreign investors from the country currently. Do you agree with that notion? Do you think we're being a little bit too, too hype about it?
Well, I think it's the way the system and the model has worked for the last 70 odd years. It's always predicated and based on the idea that markets will go according to perception and what is put out there as sentiment. So in the last several weeks, since we've had all of these issues around whether South Africa is going to host the BRICS summit, what's going to happen, will President Putin be allowed to arrive in the country, and all of that, it's created a serious backlash and a serious impact on our currency valuation against major currencies, as well as in terms of investment sentiment, and of course a big drain on our government bond market. In fact, our South African Reserve Bank has also issued a warning, because one of the things that you got to remember is that apart from the direct impacts around whether we are aligning or non-aligning or being neutral, or whether we are being much more sentimental towards Russia in terms of the relationship between the ruling party and so forth, I think the real challenge as well is the question around how do we deal with the market, which is based in a way that also excludes. So this whole question around the fact that the currency is volatile, the fact of the matter is that we are also caught up in secondary sanctions. We are all part of the fact that we can't work or we can't do business if it is viewed that we are basically contravening sanctions according to the SWIFT banking system.
Right.
And that is a big headache for us. So the challenge for countries, not just for South Africa, it's the challenge for countries who are caught in the crosshairs of this crisis, of this conflict, but in terms of the economic fallout that's impacting on their macroeconomic sovereignty, their currency valuation, but also the fact that if you are to basically even seem to be doing business through a third party, or if goods and services are transacted and they somehow end up in Russia, you are caught in those secondary sanctions.